Welcome to a new edition of FO Talks. I'm Peter Isackson, Fair Observer's Chief Strategy Officer. Today I'm joined by Mikael Pir-Budagyan, who is a geopolitical analyst based in Washington, D.C., specialized in Eurasia. Today we're going to focus on one small part of Eurasia, where a lot of people are wondering what's going on and how it's going to evolve, and that is Eastern Europe, and particularly everything that's going on in and around the situation, the conflict in Ukraine. So, Pierre, I'm Michael. I'm Mikael. Mikael, I'm very pleased to have you here. I'm particularly interested in everything that's going on. And recently, I was following what's been happening in different countries in Eastern Europe. The most recent thing, I think, was the Czech elections, where we saw a new leader with a slightly different political orientation to what existed before, Babiš. Can you tell us a little bit about just the situation in Czechia, but then we'll move on to how it relates to everything that's going on in the surrounding area and in Europe as a whole, which is of particular interest to me because I live in France. I am a French citizen, and I'm very curious about where all this is leading us. So thank you very much for being with us.
Well, thank you, Peter, for having me. Well, I probably will start with the fact that the Czechs, as sort of the Central European country that perceives itself as the bridge between Eastern Europe and Western Europe, have been quite politically active over the past several years, and they have a pretty strong civil society as well as general civic engagement. I would say that the recent elections are anything but a surprise. The voter turnout was quite high. I think it was the highest since mid-1990s. So I would caution against speculation for democratic decline. In a sense, the participation rate has been pretty high. That said, yes, we're seeing a more populist, sort of right-wing populist shift in Czech politics, which, as I said, is not unexpected, but it's something to be reckoned with and dealt with on both on the European level and also regionally. The current or yet to be formed government is a coalition of right-wing slash populist parties. Includes ANO, the motorists, and the SPD, which is Czech right-wing party, and it has, I think, 108 seats out of 200 in the Chamber of Deputies, which gives it a majority. That said, it hasn't been formed yet, and the question remains open of how stable the coalition will be.
So I know it's too early for anyone to say how the politics in Czechia itself is going to evolve. A lot of it depends on what happens around it. But are there any predictions or forecasts now about a change of politics with regard to what was there before Babiš? What are the things that risk being not radically different, but seriously different from what we've seen in the past 3 years, let's say?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's something to anticipate, and with the caveat that predictions are always hard, especially when they're about the future. But there are certain observations that I can make. Well, number one, I'm not certain of how much immediate shift we can see. To me, it seems that the current platform that Babiš is banking on is largely domestic. And if you look at the issues they've been raising, it's, of course, the typical issue of migration, the typical issue of redistribution of wealth to foreigners, or specifically to Ukrainian refugees. It's a hot political issue in the Czech Republic as of now, as well as the general perception of European Union infringing on states' rights. That's one of the main issues that Babiš has been highlighting. And all these issues they have a foreign angle, of course, but they are largely domestic. They're largely in the psyche of the Czech society, and especially the division between the Czech electorate in the West or the central part of the Czech Republic, as well as in the East, that's more sort of a conservative electorate. I would again, caution against predicting immediate change. However, there are hints at what the priorities may be. If you look at the potential or publicized potential picks for deputy ministers of Interior, or the Minister of Economy or Finance, the ANO wing of the coalition, sort of the Babish's party, is appearing to be picking domestic ministries over foreign posts. And its coalition partners, including the Motorists, which is, again, as a small but mighty right-wing party, is designated to have a foreign minister of foreign affairs, which is, again, unclear if it's going to happen because Philip Turk still has a lot of baggage and of political risk, and things can change on a dime based on public perception. But yeah, as I said, the migration policy, or at least raising migration policy at the forefront of political discourse, as well as being more adversarial towards certain European Union policies towards the Czech Republic, and that we've already seen this. The Czech Republic is trying to get an exemption from having to work within the European Union to take care of migrants because as of now, and I think as of 2022, actually, it has the highest per capita number of refugees in the European Union. So this is their main official line.
Are those Ukrainian refugees?
Yes, yeah. Very expectable. And I was actually there when it happened in 2022. And the feeling, of course, was of overwhelming sympathy to the people arriving from Ukraine, and understandable. It's very unlike what we've seen since 2015. When, of course, the refugee crisis driven by the Middle East and North African refugees. Yes, and again, a stark contrast could be explained by societal factors, but also the general historical memory.
So would you say, because we know that the reaction in that part of Europe was very strong against the Middle East and African refugees that came in mass after the various events that have been playing out in that region. And then, as you mentioned, that the Ukrainians were accepted as our own people, really. Has that changed? Are the Ukrainians no longer perceived by the Czech, I'm talking about the Czech citizens, as being their close relatives and their close people that they can feel comfortable having amongst them?
Yes, well, I wouldn't be able to speak, yes, for the Czech people because I'm neither the Czech citizen nor live in the Czech Republic. But from my recollection, it's been pretty clear that the perception of generous financial support from the public sector to the arriving refugees has been perceived as something of an unfair advantage that they get. And it's a typical sort of reaction and counter-reaction issue, where, of course, there is a sort of ample sympathy towards arriving people that are trying to escape the conflict, but there are trickle-down effects, that there are effects that will manifest themselves in a period of time. And now it's been, of course, seized by the opposition, sort of the idea that refugees are actually taking a toll on the financial resources of the state and the citizens are not being prioritized. It's a political issue. Whether that's actually the case, I cannot speak for it because I don't focus on the Czech economy, and it could be actually the opposite, where a lot of refugees who came were highly skilled and they contribute to the economic growth. But what matters is optics. Of course, what matters is optics and the dissatisfaction of the media landscape, where a lot of people in the electorate believe, rightly or not, that refugees are sucking up resources. And we've seen that in multiple countries, and it's not specific to Ukraine. Of course, there is higher degree of sympathy, both because the Ukrainians are practically neighbors, and there is a historical memory of the neighboring large country attacking the Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia. So if there is that, and it cannot be discounted.
Yeah. Are there refugees still coming, or are we talking about the refugees who arrived 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 3 years ago? Has that stabilized? Is there a refugee population? And I'm speaking not only of Czechia, but also of Hungary, and that's the elephant in the room as well, as what the relationship is with a personality people know much more about, Viktor Orban. But I'm curious about, because I simply don't know about it, the refugee situation? Are they people who have essentially been there for 3 years, or is it a moving situation? Is it a situation in which the streams of people are still coming in?
Of course, I believe the refugees still are coming into these countries, but not at such a scale. Obviously, when in February 2024, such a shock created a massive refugee wave that was accommodated by hosting countries. But as the conflict drags on, people make choices, and they either actually return to Ukraine or decide to move out of Ukraine with strict limitations. Obviously, men of military age cannot do that. And that's why it's naturally subsided, but I'm sure there is steady flow of people, not at such a scale. And the question again is of the receiving country, and also what other opportunities people can find outside the Czech Republic. Of course, the Czech Republic or the countries that are bordering Ukraine will have to process these individuals, but at the end of the day, the destination country can be Germany or other European country that has policies that are more accepting of people who arrive.
So let's go back to the elephant in the room, Viktor Orban. What is the perception of Babish's relationship with Orban? Can we talk about a coalition with Slovakia, Czechia, and Hungary? And if it is a coalition, what kind of weight do they have, and what is their position with regard to the European Union? Now, that's a big question. There are a lot of dimensions to it. Mm-hmm. But if you could just tell us a little bit about that.
No, it's a fascinating issue that we are still yet to uncover the specifics of, because as you're aware, there used to be this coalition, sort of a loose coalition of Visegrad 4, including Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovakia, and Poland, which has been effectively dysfunctional during the still present Czech government, because both Slovakia and Hungary have not had, let's say, the same agenda or the same position. And it transformed into the Czech Republic working with Poland more closely on the issue of supporting Ukraine, whereas Slovakia and Hungary have been of a different opinion, have been stalling the support for multiple reasons. That can change. I expect that to change, but not as dramatically, again, as people expect. There are a multitude of interests involved, and I'm strongly against equating Babiš to Orban or to Fico, because all these people have different motivations, different electorates, and different systems domestically and internationally to deal with. That said, the effect that will be seen on the European Union level is that the European decision-making over foreign affairs will be even further complicated. Of course, because of the unanimity issue, one has to appease or give certain leeways to parties that are willing to stall the decision-making. And that will be much harder with yet another party that is willing to use its veto right.
So the question in my mind, when I see this kind of movement taking place, even Poland has been changing its position, as I understand it, that there's less, the sympathy they had with Ukraine spontaneously and massively at the beginning has waned a bit. Is that true to say that Poland is evolving somewhat away from the basic European position, and somewhat not necessarily in the direction of Orban and Fico, but is there some kind of dynamic there that we need to understand? Specifically with regard to Poland,
Yeah, I wouldn't categorize necessarily Poland as moving away or becoming less eager to support Ukraine, because it's still one of the sort of foremost countries in the European Union, within the European framework, that is dedicated to supporting Ukraine. That said, again, Ukraine and Poland have not had a steady, friendly relationship during history. They have standing historical issues that are still being highlighted, but I don't think they take precedence over the immediate issues of European or pan-European security. I don't see Polish commitments to Ukraine waning to zero or significantly, there are limits to how much the Polish authorities can do based on their own calculation of their security risks and the reactions to the actions by the Russians. But I don't see them being subsided. I don't see the support being subsided, especially if you're comparing them to other European countries that have not made such commitments based on if you compare the GDP commitments to supporting Ukraine. Again, Poland perceives itself as the country that is championing the Ukraine cause to skeptics in Western Europe or the old Europe that don't see the direct consequences of the conflict. And I think this stays relevant regardless of the societal attitudes. There are shifts in specific policy concerns or specific policy design, but the overarching theme is, in my opinion, constant.
There is the agricultural question. I know that the Poles were very worried about trade agreements or the lack of the canceling of quotas or embargoes or whatever it is that have been put on import of agricultural products from Ukraine. I mean, this is a worry in Poland, as I understand it. Is that significant enough to diminish or change in any way the commitment that Poland has to Ukraine?
Mm-hmm. It's one of the issues that are negotiated with European policymakers or European bureaucracy. This way, Poland can carry some weight during the decision making and get exemptions or get certain policies or to change certain policies on the European level to allow for certain protections of the agricultural sector. And similar actually to the Czech Republic. I mean, the Babiš currently holds one of the massive agricultural conglomerates, which he is perceived to have a conflict of interests in if he becomes the prime minister. But again, all these issues are issues of negotiation during the decision-making process. I don't think they take precedence over the theme of supporting Ukraine, at least in Poland, at least for now. And as we've seen it play out, there is always the public statements that are being made by Polish officials or European officials, and then they are the groundwork for negotiations over policy. And that policy is being negotiated through these levers, including public statements as well as more closed meetings. And I think it's just part of how you negotiate policy in favor of your country in the European Union.
So let's talk about the perception of unity within the union, because it is a union. In my opinion, opinion of a lot of people, it's not functioning in a very efficient way today. I don't know how much of that you would attribute to the ongoing situation in Ukraine. But let's go back to Ukraine itself. Do you have any insights into where we are in terms of what some people are evoking, which is an end game to the war itself? Is there anything new that we know about that we can reliably mention as being the way of imagining or thinking about how things are going to evolve in Ukraine itself, and from the point of view of the different European countries, including the Union itself, with regard to that, the battlefield situation?
Mm-hmm. I'll split, if I may, I'll split this question into two. So the question of European unity and cohesiveness, which is a whole issue of its own, and then the question of the military conflict. And I'm not a Ukraine scholar, but one thing I would say is that it's pretty steady, and it's been consistent on the part of the Russians that it's a war of attrition, and they are treating Ukraine resources, because the perception on the Russian side is that they have fewer or less of these resources in Ukraine, mainly specifically the manpower. And we see that the battlefield is continuously changing incrementally, but it's by design. And I'm not sure how long it can last, because I'm not a military analyst, but that steady pressure is building up, and of course the European Union and European countries that support Ukraine can feel it, and they are in desperate need for specific unified policy. Going to the first part of the question, I don't see the cohesiveness that's required on the part of the European countries and the resolve to act, frankly, since 2022. I mean, of course, we've had the conversations of European security and the sort of existential risks posed by the Russian Federation, or perceived existential risks posed by Russia. But I think the rhetoric was not matched by material commitment of resources on the part of the Europeans, if we're looking at the European perspective. There were countries that were championing supporting Ukraine, especially in the eastern flank or Central Eastern Europe, but a lot of countries in traditional old Europe or Western Europe, Southern Europe, have not committed as much. And it's being felt. It's being felt both politically, it's being felt economically, because countries that support Ukraine higher share of their GDP, they are rightfully asking questions of how much commitment can be done through their neighbors in the West. Again, that said, there is also a sort of a European Union-led initiative for European Peace Facility that distributes resources to support Ukraine, but these issues have to be generated, or these solutions are generated ad hoc, because the European Union, as infrastructure, both bureaucratically and politically, was not prepared to face a shock of that magnitude in 2022. And a lot of these initiatives are very nascent. They're very member state driven. And I have to give some grace to the Commission that is facing a massive pressure from all angles. But the reality is still that we are yet to see sort of a harmonious European foreign policy that we used to talk about before 2022. We've talked about sort of the future of the European Federation. I remember when I lived in Europe. And these conversations are, to me, postponed indefinitely.
So how big is the risk that Europe itself may implode as a unified political entity?
I think it's much more resilient than people think, because there are obvious benefits to being in the European Union, including economic benefits and general societal benefits, and they are unchanged irrespective of the conflict. The question is how the functioning of European institutions is perceived, and whether this is a challenge for the current Commission and the Commissions to follow, how to make European Union a coherent actor, especially in the age of great power competition, when European economic power has to be used cohesively, and it has not been yet. It's been used through sort of the trade regulations or specific EU specific regulations on what goods can enter the European Union, but there hasn't been all that much forward thinking, sort of forward projection of European power, primarily because of that disunity. And I think any conflict, whether that's the war in Ukraine or refugee crisis or future potential issues related to pandemics, will highlight these issues, and they are standing issues of any union that tries to be supranational at such a level. Again, it's the fundamental question of European Union that has been raised multiple times by economists and political scientists. One of the issues, economically speaking, is the recycling of debt, especially when it comes to countries that suffered from the financial crisis much more comparatively to their neighbors. If the European Union wants to stay viable in the long run, there has to be a mechanism for debt recycling, argued by multiple economists, specifically Greek. But these issues have to be thought through, and crises of such magnitude like the war in Ukraine just highlight them and make the immediate effects much worse than we can anticipate.
Well, wouldn't you say that the crisis situation has been aggravated this year, first of all, by the arrival of Trump at the White House and the policies he has imposed, which include the refusal to be as generous as Biden was to the Ukrainian cause, which puts all of the burden, it appears all of the burden on the Europeans. And at the same time, the Europeans, countries like France, where I live, are having an impossible time. Belgium as well, and the UK, an impossible time working out how to organize their own budgets, and at the same time look forward to supporting a war, which many of them are planning. I find this very contradictory, but maybe there is a way out. I don't know if you see one.
Unfortunately, I don't have sort of the magic wand to see the way out. But as you rightfully point out, we can just observe reality, and that reality is complicated. With the new Trump administration, the European Union and European countries, frankly, haven't faced anything new. I think even Trump 1.0 or Obama or Biden administration has been pretty clear that the United States is interested in European allies to be stepping up. It's not a Trump-created motto. It's not specific to the Republicans. It's pretty bipartisan that the European allies must spend more on defense. It's a standing issue. The Trump administration, the first Trump administration, and especially the current one, is making it a critical issue, and they're willing to commit resources to delivering that issue, whether that's on paper or not. We've seen the commitment to 5% GDP spending on some countries. The question is how that money, of course, is spent on infrastructure or wages.
Is it viable, given that what Trump has asked Europe to do is not only to support directly the government of Ukraine, not just the war effort, not just the delivery of weapons, but also to purchase the weapons from the US and therefore pay on both sides, while the European populations, amongst which I find myself, are wondering, what does all this mean? Can we do it? And do we have governments that can actually survive the pressure? And that's what we're feeling here in France. I know it's the case in Germany. We've talked about Eastern Europe, but Western Europe has its own problems.
No, you're absolutely right. The question here is sort of short-term effects versus long-term plans. And we've talked about, I'm hearing conversations about European rearmament and reindustrialization of Europe. But frankly, all the resources that are being committed may well not end up with specific actual, realized projects if the short-term crises derail them. And the future of European industry is also under question based on the multitude of factors and the lack of competitiveness and coherence on the part of the European bureaucratic infrastructure. So I hear you, especially as a person who lived in Europe, that to the populations, it feels at best cynical that the resources are spent or committed while there is a clear crisis domestically. But that said, I believe a lot of European policymakers would be more optimistic, saying that because we are spending more on issues that the United States cares about, we can still have a seat at the table politically. And that has been the case, especially over the negotiations of peace in Ukraine. The Europeans have adopted a starkly different position from the Trump administration and managed to have an effect on the thinking in Washington, or at least the capacity to act in Washington, because there is no peace in Ukraine without European support or without European agreement.
Well, that's a very speculative question, because how do you achieve peace? Either there is a victory on one side or the other. And it seems to me today that the betting would be more on Russia's side than on Ukraine's side or NATO's side, or some kind of agreement can be reached between parties that have great difficulty even talking to each other. The Europeans refused to talk to the Russians. Trump surprised the Europeans by accepting to talk to the Russians. How is it even possible to imagine a peace coming out of this? So it can be a long-term war of attrition. And then we come back to the same question I asked earlier: how can the Europeans financially support it? I don't know whether from Washington, D.C., how things look. But this seems to me a very confusing situation, especially as the Europeans, if the Europeans did want to go ahead with what they're talking about, and that is essentially creating a kind of military-industrial complex on a European scale, that is fraught with confusion because they're dependent on technology from the US. So it's not independent of the US. So it is NATO, but the US is no longer assuming the leadership of NATO. And the disagreement or potential disagreement amongst all the important European countries, which include France, Germany, but also Poland, and the Scandinavian countries as well, who are now totally involved in NATO. It's very difficult to see how some kind of rational structure could be built using the logic of developing military Keynesianism to regenerate a healthy economy in Europe.
That's $1 million question. The question again, but I would push back on one of the points that you mentioned about U.S. leadership in NATO. In fact, it hasn't been perceived as such. It hasn't been perceived that the Trump administration has abandoned NATO. Actually, if you look at sort of based on media reporting, the relationship with the NATO secretary is pretty close because the Trump administration, or Trump himself, his personality, managed to, at least on paper, get allies to commit to higher spending. Well, again, as we say, with the caveat whether that spending is sustainable and how the money is spent. That's one of the key issues. I'm not an economist.
Wouldn't you say that Trump, the way he behaves, and this is Trump, there's nothing surprising about it, sees NATO not as an ally, but or as something he's integrally a part of, but as a customer. Isn't that the way he's treating it now? NATO buys equipment, military equipment, from the US, and that's fine. We can live together in that way. Doesn't that represent Trump's point of view? That's publicly expressed. Maybe something else is happening in the background. I don't know.
And you touched on an interesting issue that is perceived as different from the first Trump administration to the second Trump administration. In the first time around, there's been still an architecture of distinct sort of technocrats and functionaries that hold the policy together, policymakers who are not maybe visible to the public, but they know how the procedure works. And Trump, in a lot of his erratic stunts or decision-making, has been constrained by that process and procedure, which holds U.S. policy towards its allies or adversaries steady. In the second Trump administration, a lot of that architecture has been dismantled willingly by the incoming cabinet because it acted as an obstacle to some decision-making of the Trump administration. That said, there is still procedure that the current White House does not always respect, but it's still in place. In many cases, some commentary on some public comments made by Trump as the president are retracted more calmly and silently, or worked out in private with the allies. And I wouldn't say he is hell-bent on sort of making NATO countries just a consumer. Of course, there is the sort of the transactional rhetoric, but a lot of people in the US, including my former boss at the Belfer Center, would say that take Trump seriously, but not literally. It has limitations. This phrase has limitations, but very often what we see in public is slightly different of what we can expect in a private setting with actual deals being made and material commitments to European security. Because the United States is not just the White House. It's an entire architecture of decision-making, people on the ground, to State Department, as well as other agencies. And you cannot easily just fully turn off the lights. That's a process, and the European Union is trying to play part in that process, and that's why there is sort of change in rhetoric, change in, at least on paper, commitment of resources to curry favors with the administration in the United States that's willing to be more transactional. I think they're playing the dance, transatlantic dance that's not very convenient to Europeans at the current moment, but it's necessary to keep the relationship going, because the alternative, of course, is the Trump administration pursuing its own policy with no regard to European allies, which is, of course, suboptimal on their part.
It remains extremely ambiguous when you consider that Ursula von der Leyen promised to purchase, $750 billion worth of American military supplies over the next, 10 years? First of all, can Europe afford it? And doesn't that turn Europe into the kind of customer I mentioned from Trump's point of view? So he can sit back and say, I've made a sale. Now they're prisoners of my technology. Everything's right in the world. It doesn't matter what they do. It doesn't matter even how the war in Ukraine ends. I've achieved my goals. Is that perception totally false?
No, it's. I think you're right, Peter, that there is a growing dependency on the United States, coincidentally with sort of the attempts to talk about European strategic autonomy, both by France and trying to rely on pan-European resources. There is a contradiction here, and of course, this contradiction may have long-term consequences, also outside of military technology, but generally on the energy side. The European Union has been buying more United States energy at a higher price, but that's again a political decision. Of course, if we look at purely market sources, we cannot explain why European countries decide to move away from Russian hydrocarbons, but politically it is crystal clear. And there is a price to pay when you're part of an ongoing effort to support a country engaged in one of the largest wars in the European continent for the past 70 years. So it would be, in my opinion, naive to expect everything to be steady, and especially counting all the sort of the factors of the Trump administration being a disrupting administration. The pan-European unity is suffering fundamentally, and also you have a continental conflict of a large scale right next to the borders of the European Union, with countries bordering Ukraine expressing grave concerns over their security. On top of that, there is a change in material commitment to the security of those countries, in changes in rotation schedules or the training programs that the United States used to provide. So there are a lot of moving parts, and I don't see good news being a common thread. So I think our task here is to see the main risks rather than identify what's good and what is sort of hopeful. The main risks here are, of course, the long-term degradation of the European power, European economic power and industrial power, if decisions are not being made currently with an actual foresight into how they will play out in the long term.
Yeah, everything I've been describing, in a way, I meant to build up to a point of which you could call more cultural than political, and that is the growing perception in Europe, because of the kind of relationship that they see with the Trump administration, or the kind of dialogue or non-dialogue that's taken place with the Europeans, is the perception that Europe is a set of vassal states, totally under the control of someone who isn't even trying to exercise control. And this is creating a great deal of psychological confusion. And then if you go back to Eastern Europe, you have the problem we mentioned earlier of these Eastern European nations feeling that they are vassals of Brussels. So are we entering a period of feudal conflict? Would that be does that have any bearing on the situation today?
Yeah, you could describe it as such, but I would say that it's not new. The perception of European sort of great bureaucrats infringing on regions' rights or states' rights and taking over certain critical areas that people hold near and dear is not new. You look at the eastern part of the Czech Republic; it's pretty clear. Even though European projects are used to fund a lot of infrastructure there or renovation of infrastructure. Now, what matters again is optics and the perceptions, and a lot of political movements are capitalizing on those Eurosceptic ideas. But as I said in the beginning, the crises that we had or the issues that we had pre-2022 were just put at the forefront of the table, and they're being aggravated by the continuation of this conflict and other conflicts also and other crises around the world. So this disunity has not been triggered by the invasion of Ukraine. It's been crystallized, rather. And there is a need for leadership. There is a need for clarity and I wouldn't say pan-European camaraderie, but a clearer understanding of what can be achieved rather than sort of a public polemics. And unfortunately, what I have seen is a lot of the latter. Sort of, there is a lot of public statements. There is divisive rhetoric, the comparing of Orban, Fico, or Babiš as to Trump. Sort of, whenever there is a new populist leader coming to a European country, they're like Trump-like leader, and I think it simplifies the situation to the detriment of the actual solutions. I think, as you mentioned yourself, dialogue is something that cannot be discounted and cannot be neglected, even at the time when there is an active military conflict, both on the side of the conflicting sides, sort of the conflicting parties, but also within the party that aims to support Ukraine. European officials have to communicate with member states directly and with a certain degree of understanding of where they're coming from, because their electorate rightfully chose them. And I would want to point out that there hasn't been almost any speculation that the most recent parliamentary elections in the Czech Republic have been somehow sponsored by the Russians. Of course, there is a lot of misinformation and disinformation allegations, which very often can be credible, especially counting with the fact that who we're dealing with, what parties, what coalition is going to come to rule the Czech parliament. But there is an organic side to it. Of course, there is a societal reaction to a lot of policies of the previous government or Top 09 coalition. There's been very pan-European, pro-NATO and readily supportive of Ukraine. There is a reaction by the electorate. And that's why these politicians are successful in this time. And I think a wise choice would be to actually deal with them and work with them to figure out a way to not compromise the fundamental principles of countries in the Western European Union. And that it doesn't seem to be done. I think at least on the national level, I've been pretty surprised by how much perceived rapport there was between the president and the likely future prime minister of the Czech Republic, between President Petr Pavel and Babiš. That can change. That can change because the working relationships can be destroyed overnight based on a particular divisive issue. And I think the goal here is to stay in lane within the area of unity, find a common ground, and work on common interests, especially within a union that seeks to be sort of an example of a successful political and economic union that can inspire less conflict around the globe.
That all sounds great, and theoretically, that's how things should work. My perception is that unity is very difficult even to imagine today. I mean, Europeans being unified in the idea that they have a common mission of any kind. I think my perception is that there's a crisis of what I would call a sovereignty crisis, which is a kind of identity crisis politically. We've been struggling for 30, 40, maybe 70 years to create a European identity. And to some extent that was achieved. I worked very consistently with the European Commission over 25 years. on projects, but and there was a great feeling that we were achieving something. But I do have the feeling today that the belief in that kind of achievement, first of all, is that achievement was never completed. It was a process that was going in a good direction, but that it may be all over now. That would be the ultimate pessimistic reading of Europe. And there are people who are predicting the implosion of the European Union, of NATO, but I mean they're also predicting the implosion of the stock market and the economy. So there's all kinds of doomsday scenarios that we can all enjoy in our spare time. Still, it doesn't look all that good. And so I want to raise one final question, because I know this is an area of expertise for you, but it's the other elephant in the room. The nuclear deterrence. Is it real? Is it weaker than it was 5 years ago, let's say, or 10 years ago? Has it changed? And what are the perspectives on the nuclear balance in the world?
It's a big question, which I will try to sort of answer with some level of credibility. But I would say it's very real. Nuclear deterrence has been proven to work, actually, to the detriment of countries that try to support Ukraine in a sort of consistent manner, because Russian nuclear reminders, or President Putin's nuclear reminders, have worked, especially when they've been presented with a degree of actual resource commitment or credibility, especially in the fall of 2022, when I think the U.S. intelligence assessed the likelihood of nuclear use at 50%. That was the time when the Russians were retreating in the northeastern Ukraine, and that stalled a lot of decision making in Washington, because the policymakers were concerned that additional aid to Ukraine or yet another system that would be delivered to Ukraine for use would provoke or trigger an unacceptable response on the side of the Russians. That said, it's still unclear to what extent these signaling issues or these nuclear reminders can depreciate over time, because the more they're being employed, the less credible they may be perceived as. And I think a lot of European countries are starting to, especially in the East, are starting to question the credibility of these nuclear reminders if there is no material commitment, or if there is no good intelligence to assess their credibility or assess the resolve on the part of the Russians. Again, we are not talking only about the transatlantic nuclear security. We are living in a global nuclear competition where countries are actively modernizing their arsenals. The United States, Russia, China is trying to catch up to both United States and Russia in the number of nuclear warheads. And it's not a good time to talk about sort of traditional arms control deals, because the only governing treaty that we still have is the New START, set to expire next year. And I don't see any likelihood of it being extended, despite the sort of formal proposals by the Russian government or President Putin himself to extend it informally for another year without negotiating a new deal right after it expires. There is a lot of interest in changing the defense posture, both in the United States and in Russia. It has been done in Russia with the adoption of a new sort of strategic defense or the strategy of defense that pertains to nuclear weapons and the use of nuclear weapons. It officially has been expanded to more ambiguous areas where the Russian Federation would be willing to use nuclear weapons, specifically if there is an attack against Russian Federation, even by a non-nuclear state that is supported by a nuclear state. I would say that it's not actually new policy, but it's been verbalized. When it comes to the general overarching issue of nuclear stability and strategic stability, I think there are a lot of conversations, especially on the side of the hawks in the United States and other countries, that stability per se is not sort of an end-all, be-all. It's not a goal in itself, which I disagree with, but the conversations hint at the period of rearmament or the increased spending on nuclear weapons or delivery systems, formation, testing of new delivery systems. We've seen the Russians test two presented as new delivery systems, including sort of the nuclear-powered missile and the torpedo, nuclear-powered torpedo. The technology has been there for years, but it's been put in fruition or realized just recently, announced in 2018. The Americans have responded. I'm sure you followed Trump's social media tweets or social media posts about how it's going to restart nuclear testing. Highly ambiguous what that means. And it hasn't been clarified all that much. I think he hinted at, he specifically talked about non-explosive testing, so the testing of delivery vehicles still being done even before his post. So there is a lot of ambiguity that's not helping stability. It's not helping the clarity of communication between nuclear powers, and that's highly dangerous in the period where a lot of confusion and a lot of channels have been severed. Channels of communication and backroom conversations have been severed. So I don't want to leave you with a very pessimistic outlook on the world, but we don't live in a time where the community that is trying to promote arms control has a strong and definitive response to what we see in state behavior. I think we live in the period of rearmament or instability rather than stability.
So is there any hope that that could change, that there could be an awareness of the absolute urgency of addressing the issues? I was a teenager in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was a real thing. We actually believed that, at any moment we could see the mushroom-shaped cloud exploding in our neighborhood. And I think it was very possible that that could have happened at the time. We talked earlier about the fact that there's a kind of reluctance to engage in dialogue today and diplomacy. Doesn't this make the situation even more dangerous?
Absolutely. I think you hit the nail on its head that dialogue is perceived as appeasement very often. I happen to disagree with that. Dialogue is an integral part of statecraft and is just on a spectrum of kinetic response. Whether it's kinetic or sort of dialogue response, it doesn't have to disqualify one or the other. And we've seen that a lot of conversations, especially on these critical issues, have been sidelined because of the unwillingness to engage with the other side because it's perceived as aggressive or conniving or trying to trick you into believing that they have actual goodwill behind their proposals. And that lack of trust is very concerning because if you think about it, during the Cold War, we had the United States and the Soviet Union, countries that at least on paper, or the Soviet Union specifically on paper, is a revolutionary power seeking the end of the capitalist system. So it's an existential issue at hand. And they still managed to sign over 7 binding arms control deals. Yeah. And when we talk about the lack of trust right now, I don't think it's at such a low, but it's down there. And it has to be nurtured or revived. And it's not going to take very little time. It's going to take a long time to rebuild the institutions, sort of the regime around arms control infrastructure, and to make it work. A lot of people who work on these issues are not in their prime age. Like speaking more sort of granularly, people who have experience of arms control talks in Russia and in the United States are not young. And that expertise, those ties, those bridges are going away. So unfortunately, with that lack of dialogue comes increased instability. And I think I would coin sort of the opinion of Ruth Gottemüller, who I consider sort of the arms control guru in a sense, if it's appropriate to say. But her idea is that we need to start talking about other issues that we can agree on. And then through that trust built in these side conversations, getting the counterparts to the table at least, and then talking about the issues that there might be disagreement or the issues that require more trust. is the way to go. But again, the two things that are required is consistency in this approach, sort of the consistent willingness and resolve to rebuild trust, and at the end of the day, material commitment. And we don't have either. So the question at hand is, when will be the prime moment to start rebuilding it? And I think we are long overdue.
Yes. Well, on that largely sad note, I mean, I remain optimistic. I think we all do. Our better angels will one day guide us, but it doesn't look all that great. Still, we simply have to observe what's going on with patience and whatever form of wisdom we can muster up, and hope that everything turns out all right.
Yes, hope is something that cannot be taken away from us.
Exactly. Not yet. Not yet.
Not yet.
I'm sure there are people working on that, but we have that. We can keep it. So thank you, Mikael. This is very interesting. I'd like to pick this conversation up in about 6 months' time.
We'll see. We'll see how much will change.
Kind of progress report on it and see where we are, because I don't know what your opinion is. I think we're going to see a lot of some dramatic moves in the next 6 months. A lot of people are predicting it, but doesn't mean anything. They predict all kinds of things. But I think we are at a point where some things are going to be clarified, whether we like it or not. And let's hope that the wiser among us are involved in doing that.
Yeah, I agree. The only thing that keeps us awake at night is events. So on that note, it was a pleasure to talk to you, Peter. Thank you for having me again, and I would love to chat more once the situation changes.
Well, thank you very much, Mikael.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.